Okay, welcome everybody to this afternoon's session. We are hoping to have a few more attendees coming into the room. Maybe some people are still out drinking coffee, but we have a full and interesting program, so we'll get started right away. It is my pleasure and a great honor to welcome you to this afternoon's session. I especially wish to welcome our three distinguished panelists, and please be assured that I will introduce them briefly to you before we start. But let me first introduce you to the topic and the aims of this session. Our discussion this afternoon is dedicated to the question of placements, fellowships, safe havens for at-risk and refugee academics and fellows. In my role as Head of Division for Strategic Planning at the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, I am, among other issues, in charge of the Phillip Schwartz initiative. One of the wonderful things about this initiative is that it has brought us into contact with other organizations working in the area of refugee programs. It is good to see that there are colleagues working towards the same goal, and I'm very grateful for the collaboration. All of us are driven by similar questions. How do you provide safe havens for academics at risk who need temporary refuge? How do you find placements? How do you provide enough fellowships? Can we learn from each other and collaborate to provide the best solutions? These are open questions, there are no fixed answers, and I'm very pleased that we have three panelists who will help us set the stage for potential answers. Let me introduce them to you. On my far right, we have Sarah Willcox. She's director of the IIE Scholar Rescue Fund. She has over 15 years of experience in higher education, grants administration, and nonprofit management. To my right is Laura Lohéac. She's director of the French program for at-risk scholars called PAUSE, which is hosted by the Collège de France. Previously, she was advisor for international solidarity actions at the Office of the Secretary of State for Higher Education and Research. To my left is Stephen Wordsworth. He's executive director of the Council for At-Risk Academics. Before joining Cara, Stephen was a career member of the UK Diplomatic Service. I would like to start our session by asking each of our panelists to explain to us in about 7 minutes what are the essentials about your organizations, and especially what a threatened scholar must do to receive support from your organization. I would like to start with Sarah, then Laura, and then Stephen.
Barbara, can you repeat the first part of the question?
Was that maybe in a nutshell, your organization, and then what a scholar must do to receive funding from your organization?
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's, thanks to Barbara, the Scholars at Risk Network, Freie Universität, for having us. It's always a pleasure to see the incredible number of scholars and universities and partners around the world who are engaged in this work. I've personally been involved in the work of the Scholar Rescue Fund for now 14 years, and the field, as they say, has grown exponentially, so it's encouraging. Our program was founded on the heels of quite a long history of the Institute of International Education, which is the parent organization of the Scholar Rescue Fund. We're based in New York, but we're a global program. The Institute actually has a long history helping scholars dating back to the Bolshevik Revolution, scholars affected by the Hungarian uprising, as was mentioned in the plenary earlier on, Nazi Germany, and scholars in apartheid South Africa. So there's a long history responding to particular crises around the world. And when the program that I work for now was founded in 2002, it was founded because it was recognized that these crises don't happen in isolated moments of history, that scholars are threatened around the world all the time, sadly. And so the program that we designed, which has grown over the years and has developed and responded to crises around the world, is really to respond to the individual who is affected by corrupt censorship. It could be personal targeted attacks for their academic work. A scholar may be affected by human rights abuses because of their personal identity, religious identity, any number of issues. But most of the scholars we work with are directly affected and are directly targeted by a particular force that is forcing them into censorship, like I said, dissent, or maybe seen as a force against positive change and democratic movements. So we're really trying to respond to the individual scholar, but recognizing as well that there are national academies under threat around the world as well. So we've been helping scholars now from 58 different countries. We've placed them at universities, 380 universities so far, in 43 different countries. So it's very much a global effort, but it also speaks to the global nature of the threats facing scholars. We've helped mostly scholars from the Middle East, affected by the crisis and the US-led invasion of Iraq. Syria, of course, increasingly, and Turkey as well. But we've helped people from individual crises affecting them for their individual voices on a particular topic. One scholar from one country may be safe, but another scholar from that same country speaking on one issue may not be safe, and we've responded to those cases as well. So when we respond to a scholar, we effectively assess two basic essential criteria. One, is this person a scholar? And that definition is quite is a topic of conversation every time our selection committee comes to meet. Who and what is a scholar? I can go on for hours about how that conversation develops, but effectively it's a person who can undertake an academic position in a higher education institution, who has had an academic track record, publications, research, teaching perhaps. We also help public intellectuals, so scholars who may not be the traditional academic of a professor, but may be an essential voice on a particular topic or in a particular field. So that one element is, are you a scholar? And the second element really is this person threatened? And are we the organization to respond? And we recognize that we're not always the right organization for every scholar. And that's what's encouraging about this opening field, is that there are many organizations that address very particular crises and particular issues for particular scholars. And there are similar organizations helping journalists and lawyers. So we recognize we're not the answer for everybody. But in our work, we also, the essential part of our work is the partnership with a university. And that means that we have to find a home institution that will take in a scholar as a visiting fellow for typically 1 year. We provide $25,000 as a base foundation of the fellowship, and we ask the host university to match that funding. So it's very much a partnership with the university to invite that scholar in as a visiting academic. We do the extensive vetting within our program, so we accept applications directly from a scholar. He or she may be referred from a human rights organization. He or she may have heard about us from a colleague who's already been helped by us. He or she may have learned about us through the wider networks that we're part of, but we take these applications directly from the scholar, him or herself. And we assess these basic criteria. Is this person a scholar, and is this person threatened? And it sounds basic, but it's a very involved process of reviewing the CV, the publications, the cause for concern in their home country. And one area that's been quite controversial, and I think has been discussed quite extensively here at this particular Congress, is a criteria that we've had to stick by, which is we've only been able to help those who've been out of the country for a relatively short time. So our scholars that we've helped are typically either in their home country at the time of their application, or they've only recently fled within the last 24 months or so. We recognize that that's a very difficult sort of line that we have to draw, but because of the demands on our program, we've had to create very strict criteria and certain elements. So that's the basic essential of it. And then the hosting university invites the scholar, typically sponsors their visa. Like I said, we've placed scholars around the world, so every placement is very different. The US, even though we've placed many scholars in the US, every university approaches this program very differently. Then there are sort of national policies that affect certain countries like France and Germany that we've had to understand over time. So it's a very individual approach. But the approach is that we understand that with every scholar, we're not only protecting their work, but we're protecting a much wider body of work. Not only their work while on the fellowship, but also hoping to protect the work that they can do to touch their scholars and students back in their home country. So in one example, we actually, during the peak of the Iraq crisis, from 2007 to 2014, we actually established a sort of sub-program within Scholar Rescue Fund, which was to respond to the huge numbers of Iraqi scholars who had applied to our program. And within that project, it was a really keen interest in keeping scholars within the region and placing them as close to Iraq as possible, for obvious reasons like language, mobility, but also so that they could continue somehow to keep in touch with their students and their faculty back in Iraq. And that started as a very sort of humble approach because the bandwidth, the technology in Iraq at the time was quite limited. So we actually were recording lectures of Iraqi scholars in Jordan and sometimes in Lebanon and Syria at the time, recording them on DVD and then physically shipping them back into Iraq where they would be played as components of an academic lecture in the Iraqi universities. So in that way we were feeding back exiled scholars into their academies. And it's now grown into a live stream recording process that we continue to do from Jordan. So these are little elements that we're sort of learning that may or may not be scalable, but I think they are, and I think it's something that this work that we all do together, we have to keep in mind that this is not about brain drain, drawing people out of their home countries, but protecting them so that they can, in fact, contribute to their host universities very much so, but also keep in touch with their home communities as well. I think I've come to the end of my time. So that's a quick summary, but I look forward to continued conversation, so thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We'll continue right away with Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Lohéac, Executive Director of POSE, for those who were not there when Barbara introduced us. Thank you very much, Barbara, for your introduction, and thank you to SAR for inviting me to introduce POSE, which is a very young program, a French program with 40 months old. And previously, unlike major other democracies such as the United States, Germany or United Kingdom, France had no mechanisms to support scholars at risk. And POSE was launched at the instigation of the Ministry of Higher Education and Research in January 2017, so 14 months ago. It is operated by the Collège de France, which is a very prestigious institution in France, which has been willing to host us. And the Board of Trustees, which is the decisional body of the program, brings together 3 ministries, the Ministry of Higher Education and Research, the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Interior. And the Board of Trustees brings also the major research center and research bodies in France, such as CNRS, INSERM, but well, you don't know necessarily them, but it's very prestigious and famous research center. So the whole research community in France has been mobilized for this program, which is also a public-private partnerships, because we have also a partnership with associations, and we have also donators, civil society members, which participate to the POSE program. The Dean of Collège de France, Alain Prochian, and his colleague Edith Hurd, set up a Patronage Committee with eminent scientists and members of civil society. And these scientists are in charge of the assessment of the applications, but I'll come back on that later. So POSE benefited from a very strong political support and the mobilization of the higher education and research community, as well as of the political, because we have been the POSE has been launched under the previous governments in France and has been maintained and supported by the new one who has been elected in April. So we benefited from this political support with financial means. Our mission is to provide support to at-risk scholars by allowing a grant, usually for a year, to higher education and research institutions, such as universities or research centers, who aim to recruit and host them. So POSE also accompanies these institutions in providing administrative, professional and social support, as well as accommodation for the scholar or with and his or her family. So POSE is able to do this thanks to its network, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Interior, who are very supportive to help us to facilitate the procedures, and with the associations. Who is eligible for the program? Scientists from all academic disciplines and all regions of the world who are threatened and are impeded for their academic freedom. They must meet 3 criteria, and it's the same than as SRF. They hold a proven status of academic or research in their country. It's from PhD students, postdoctoral researchers, or experienced academics. They are in situation of urgency and danger, and they have been forced in exile or outside their country of origin for less than 3 years prior to the date of application, and it's the same. We had to put some limits. Researchers must find an institution willing to submit an application on their behalf. Number of candidates have pursued part of their studies in France and reconnect with their networks. And those who don't have any existing contact in France must apply via our website, web portal, and pose endeavors to assist them in identifying a host establishment, a host institution. The candidate selection process is based on assessments of emergency and on the scientific quality conducted by the scientists from the Patronage Committee and approved by the Board of Trustees. Our first results after 14 months, the 5th call for applications was launched a few weeks ago with a deadline set for the 29th of April, so on Sunday. So previously we had 4 calls for applications, and we managed to support at the end of these 4 calls 126 scientists. We are hosted or will be hosted in 60 higher education and research institutions throughout France. And the funding of 6 academics was renewed for an additional year. A few figures to provide some insights into our laureates profile. First, a noticeable point to quasi-gender parity with 45% of women. Scientists of all status, but quite young. 1/3 are PhD students, half are postdoctoral and researchers and lecturers, and 10% are researcher and confirmed researchers and professors of universities. 2/3 come from social sciences and humanities, and 1/3 from hard science, with a great diversity of disciplines. Scientists from all countries are eligible for POSE program, but most of our laureates come from the Middle East. POSE was originally conceived for Syrians, and 30% of our laureates come from Syria, but with the authoritarian evolution of the Turkish regime, which has worsened since July 2016, nearly 60% of our laureates are Turkish. The others come from Yemen, Iraq, Algeria, Venezuela, Pakistan, and Russia. Our challenges on the way ahead. The first challenge is of course, to ensure the sustainability of the program and to consolidate POSE integration on the national and international stage. To this end, we have to secure POSE funding, of course, public as private, which will determine our level of ambition. A major challenge is to give the laureates a professional perspective, because the issue of the continuity of their integration and the stabilization of their situation must be addressed after their year or the 2 years in POSE. And that's why we are exploring other funding opportunities, European or international scholarships, for example, local funding, and we are establishing partnership with associations and private enterprises to assist laureates whose skills would be valuable for enterprises to find opportunities within the private sector. Another priority is to set up a solidarity network, what we call POSE community, with the goal of creating connections, including tutoring or mentoring between laureates, and allowing exchanges of good practices, of good experience and lesson learned between host institutions. coordination and sharing of experience with the other similar programs and working with international organizations, particularly the United Nations, will also increase our response capacity in the context of growing international instability. So it's one of our priorities. Finally, POSE is above all an operational program, but we also have the ambition to develop an advocacy mission to contribute to a higher awareness of the situation of academics in danger, to participate in research programs, and in the longer term, of course, to contribute to the scientific reconstruction in post-crisis countries. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be glad to pursue the discussion with any question.
A little later. Thank you, Laura. And I'd like you to continue.
Thank you very much. Cara has a history going back 85 years. It was founded in 1933 by academics and scientists in the UK to help support their colleagues from Germany who were being forced out of their jobs by the Nazis who just come to power. Initially, the focus was mainly on Jewish academics, because fairly soon it became others. If you fast forward 85 years, essentially we're now helping anybody from anywhere. Our founders defined their mission as having two parts: the relief of suffering and the defense of learning and science. The relief of suffering bit essentially means helping the individual, helping them to get away from danger and finding a suitable position where they can continue their academic work. The defense of learning and science recognizes that this is actually about more than individuals. This is about what that person represents, the intellectual capital that they and their colleagues carry in their heads, and how that can be preserved. Because in a crisis, when people are being forced out in large numbers and you hope one day they can go back and help rebuild, you can't afford to have that capital lost or dispersed. It needs to be protected, preserved, nourished, and kept ready for the day when it can be used again in that person's own country. The way we work now, primarily through two programs. The fellowship program is the one under which we help individuals get to a safe place. And in recent years, because of the pressure of numbers, we have focused very much on those who are still at physical risk. That is, either they are still in places like Syria or Iraq, where they are threatened by conflict or by extremist groups or by their own governments, or essentially, or by sort of some other more sort of form of repression or threat of arrest or whatever. So helping people get away from immediate danger to a place where they can be safe and carry on their work. That means that, unfortunately, we don't give much support nowadays to people who are already physically safe, so who may already be in the UK or in a European country, even though we recognize that they do need support. Many universities, of course, do have their own programs for refugee academics, and we will tend to encourage people to move towards those. But our focus is very much on those who are still at physical risk. In terms of numbers, we're now supporting about 280 Cara Fellows with some 350 family members, so 600 people altogether. We have 120 university partners in the UK, but also universities in other European countries and other parts of the world. People come out and come to the UK on regular visas. They're not refugees. They're very clear to us that they don't see themselves as refugees. That's not their ambition. And so they are coming in either in UK visa terms for 2 years at postdoctoral level or 3 years for a PhD. About 70% of our fellows are at postdoctoral level, the other 30% mostly PhD. To qualify for support, we define an academic as somebody who has held a teaching or research post at a university or similar institution. It doesn't need to be more specific than that, but we're not talking about first degree undergraduates. It's people who have already had some career experience. They're sometimes not a lot, and sometimes they are at a very early stage of their career. We even have some people doing master's degrees coming from situations where they were able to hold a job on the strength of a strong bachelor's degree. The other half of what we do, which I mentioned, is what we call our regional programs. The most recent, the third, is one for Syria, which is working with Syrian academics who have been pushed out of their country or forced to leave, but are still in the region. So in many cases in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and so on. And this builds on the experience of our Iraq program between 2006 and 2012, where we organized a whole series of workshops, roundtables, research programs to help those people to maintain and develop their skills, again with the idea that they could eventually return home, as most of them then did as the situation improved, although some, of course, were then caught up in the whole ISIS story and had to leave again. But nonetheless, the focus is on return. The latest program for Syria, with support from the Open Society Foundations, is currently focused mainly on those in Turkey. Now this of course raises questions of its own. When we conceived the program in 2015, it was simpler. Now, unfortunately, a number of universities in Turkey whom we had originally intended to be partners are no longer potential partners for us because of what's been happening there. And other universities are getting more nervous. And nonetheless, we are still running that program, but we are also looking at how to expand it into Jordan and Lebanon, other countries in the region, where there are significant numbers of Syrian academics. Again, the focus is on workshops to build qualifications, build experience, help them forge networks and contacts so that they can develop the skills they will need when they are able to go back, which is what they all tell us they want to do one day, although we recognize that that day may be a long time coming for some of them. For others, perhaps not so long, depending on what their own politics are. We're not a political organization. We don't judge whether somebody works within the regime system or was outside it. That's their decision. The question is, are they threatened or not? So that's a very broad outline of what we do. There are copies of our annual report on the table outside. Most of them have gone, but there are still a few left. So help yourselves if you want to know a bit more, or we can deal with questions now. Thank you.
And then later, I'll finish our first round by giving a presentation on our program, the Phillip Schwartz initiative. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me continue by giving you some information on the Phillip Schwartz initiative. The organization I represent is the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. We have more than 60 years of experience in supporting international academic collaboration. We are not quite as experienced yet in the field of supporting threatened scholars, scholars at risk. This is a new field that we opened with the program in 2015. Through the Phillip Schwartz initiative, we enable host institutions, that means universities and research institutions in Germany, to offer fellowships to researchers, scientists, and scholars at risk, who can be from any discipline and theoretically from any country of the world, as long as they are under threat and under risk. The fellowships run for 2 years, 24 months. It's a full fellowship, full coverage, and we've recently been able to introduce a 3rd year of funding on a matching funds basis. What is special about this program is, and I think this is different from some of the others that you've heard of, is that in the Phillip Schwartz initiative, a scholar cannot apply directly to us. Rather, applications reach us through the host institutions, the ones providing the fellowships, the ones providing the space for the fellows to work at once they've reached their final destination. So host institutions and fellows somehow need to come into a communication. They need to identify common projects. There has to be a mutual interest, a win-win situation. And once you've established this kind of contact, then applications can be submitted. So far, we've been able to have 4 calls in the Phillip Schwartz initiative. Our 4th call just opened in the spring and will close in the middle of May, and we hope to be announcing results in September. At present, this is not yet a permanent program, but we're hoping to turn it into a more long-term perspective because we see the need for the program, the need for support, unfortunately, continues to be there. This in a nutshell on the Phillip Schwartz initiative. Now let me return to my role as a moderator and continue around by asking each of our panelists a question. I would like to start with Sarah. You have quite a long tradition in supporting threatened scholars. And of course, you have seen many, many different careers, many different people have in your program. And I would like to know if you can say there are any kind of typical career paths that you've seen in the scholars that you support, what happens within the period of support, and what happens afterwards.
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question because, as we mentioned earlier, it's a very individual program working with very individual scholars in every possible field. So I think the career trajectory is vastly different for any one scholar from any one country. And sometimes it's just luck, that they may have ended up in a country where they happen to speak the language because they did their studies in that particular country. And there have been many cases of luck. And in those cases, I think scholars who come with the language of the host country, of course, their chances are much more secure in longer term academic, post-fellowship, as we call it, academic work. But we've seen everything from a scholar who hardly spoke English when he arrived in the United States, who within 2 years is publishing in English in peer-reviewed journals and has been hired on into a tenure-track position. So we've really seen the full scope of potential and some surprises when we see some scholars who've got 20 years of publication experience teaching international journals, who come to a very established institution in the United States and find that the competition is extraordinary, that maintaining an academic position in the US, in Western Europe, is extraordinarily difficult. So it's often very surprising to us when, when the selection committee meets and they're reviewing the applications that we put before them, there's often this sort of hopeful thought of, well, we see this person going in this direction, or we expect that this person may be able to go in that particular track. And so often our predictions are not right. So I'd like to say that there's a formula and there's a way that we can say, we will help you in this direction. But I think the greatest potential for any scholar who's coming from forced out of their country, seeking a new position, is an element that I think is quite foreign to many scholars we've worked with, which is networking. And I think it's a concept that doesn't really come from a lot of the local contexts that we've worked with scholars. It means reaching out, breaking beyond comfort zones, often thinking beyond the academic field that they're working in. We've seen some scholars who've actually moved completely from one field to another. And one example is a woman from Pakistan who is an English literature professor from Pakistan. She was threatened for political reasons, came to the US, now has a tenure-track position in New York, but she's now working on women's issues and political issues facing women in Central Asia. So she was able to use her experience and transport it into something different. So I don't have an example, I have hundreds of examples, but I think the essential part is opening oneself up to potential and possibility, and maybe that's not in academia, it's in industry, and that could be another conversation and a whole other conference, but that's my rambling answer.
Thank you. Not so rambling, actually. Continue with Stephen. You work, as you explained, your organization has been in existence for many years. You work with institutions in the UK, but also abroad. What have been the challenges you have met in terms of matching scholars at risk and institutions, and what were really the factors that persuaded the university to become a host? Was it always easy?
Was it always easy? Was it ever easy? I think that is a better question. No, there are obviously a range of challenges, not least because, as I mentioned before, we focus on people who are still at immediate risk, and so are coming to the UK or to their university in their new host country on a regular visa. And of course, getting a visa itself is a challenge. Now, we have a current success rate of around 97%, because we know how the system works, we know how to fill in the forms correctly. At least the universities are the visa sponsors, but we work with them to make quite sure that's okay. And so we have a very good record of getting visas through. We always challenge refusals, or nearly always, and are usually successful in that. The other challenge, of course, is money. Now, a few years ago, we were handling far fewer applications, and we were able to contribute more from our own resources. And essentially, we were saying to universities, if you can provide the place for this person, we will cover the accommodation and living costs. And that worked maybe 4 years ago, when we were supporting maybe 30, 40 people. As I mentioned, it's now 280 plus more than that again in family members. And we had to go back to universities 2 or 3 years ago and say, look, we can no longer do this, so can you also not only provide the place, but also provide the accommodation, provide some funding for living costs, and so on. And we thought at first that might cause a real problem. And there was a bit of a sort of pause with some universities while they thought about this. Actually, it helped. Because before, when we were saying to a university, can you just provide a place, it was something which heads of department, for example, could do on their own authority. It didn't need to be as a university decision. It was a lower level decision by an individual, and it was more or less invisible. When you say to a university, can you provide a place and cover all the costs of this person who's coming to do a PhD for 3 years, and has a partner and 3 children, then they start doing the sums and realize they're talking about a commitment of well over £100,000 over that time, which means it has to go very high in the university to get a decision. Once it has that decision, it becomes part of what the university does. it's got sign-off from the top levels. And it's then usually relatively straightforward when that person comes to the end of their particular assignment and is moving on somewhere else, to then bring somebody else in. It becomes sort of essentially a relationship between institutions rather than between individuals. And so we have been able to maintain the numbers that we have now. There are, of course, many more people we could support with more funding. It is always useful to have some funding of our own to put on the table, because not every university can afford to fund everything. Some can, some can't. Sometimes the smaller ones actually manage to do more than some of the bigger ones. It's interesting how it works. It depends very much on the sort of view from the top, whether that's something they want their university to be involved with. So essentially, it's money, it's visas, and the process takes time. And of course, you are dealing not just with cases, you're dealing with individuals who have, and like many of you here in this room, who have very distinct stories, may have gone through some pretty terrible experiences, or their family members may have gone through some very terrible experiences. All that needs to be sort of factored into the whole discussion. It is always the university's choice to accept the candidate. We'll put the candidate forward, but they have to satisfy themselves that the academic fit is correct, and we can't judge that in detail ourselves. But the great majority of applications and cases, and people get to university and it does work out. There may be some problems in settling down, but generally it works, and they take full advantage of the opportunity they've been given. As I say, this has been made possible by the increase in support from universities in the UK in particular, and over 4 years, essentially, if you tot up the total value of the fee waivers and accommodation and living cost funding and so on, over 4 years, it's gone from around £600,000 a year to £6 million a year over that 4-year period. So it's been a fantastic increase. And we also, as I mentioned, have partners outside the UK, Australia, Canada, parts of Europe and elsewhere. But we are trying to build those connections the whole time, not least because under visa rules, somebody coming for a postdoctoral study in the UK only has 2 years. Then they have to move on. So we have to have a whole process for either helping them to find a job or moving them on somewhere else where they can continue their work.
Thank you, Stephen. I think one point was struck me particularly, this idea of having it become almost a natural process for a university to host a scholar at risk, a threatened scholar, something that sort of a culture, well, this is something you do. And that's one of our goals, at least in the Phillip Schwartz initiative, to make it really almost something normal for any university to do.
One point. Sorry, another point I should have made. The other important part of this is the realization on the part of the universities. It is not about them just giving. They're also getting back. And the people they're hosting bring with them all their experiences, their skills, expertise. And that's sort of, it is a two-way process. And that's an important part of it too.
Creating win-win situations where both sides really benefit. Laura, like the Phillip Schwartz initiative, your program is relatively new, even I think 1 year younger than ours, and so it's modeled along similar lines. And I assume that at this point, like us, you were thinking about the next steps. What happens when the first round of fellows, when their fellowships end? What happens? What are the transitions? And how can you help? Would you like to share some of your thoughts, strategic thoughts on how to address this issue?
Yeah, what I haven't said, it's true that your pose is very similar to Phillip Schwartz, because the grants are allowed to the host institutions, and what I haven't said is that it's up to 60%, because POSE doesn't cover all the cost. It covers 60% of the cost. That's what I wanted to, because I had forgotten. Yeah, it's true that giving the laureates a professional perspective is the most critical issue, and it's the lesson what we learned after the first year. So some of them will find by themselves a position in the academic world, including by succeeding in competitive selection process, because in France it works like that. But for the others, we are exploring several solutions. The possibility to renew the grant, as I said earlier, because the POSE was conceived firstly to allow grant for 1 year. And it's true that now we make the constat that 1 year it's too short, and many of the scholars need a second year. But even after second year, the problem will arise, and you have this experience that even if it's 2 years, the next steps are very important issues. So that's why we are exploring other funding opportunities. We work with SRF because we have successfully organized, funded scholars who were funded by SRF previously. So it can be interesting to collaborate and to cooperate with other programs. And we try to inform our scholars of the application call and funding application call for other programs or EU scholarship programs. And the other solution, we are exploring is the partnerships with private sectors and with associations. Because we know that all the scholars will not find a position in the academic world, unfortunately, and it's very important to prepare the next steps. So one of our lessons learned, another one is that as they have to prepare with our support and with the support of the host institutions, the next steps as soon as they arrive, I would say, in the program, because it takes some time, and you must alert the laureates and the host institutions of the importance to prepare the next step as early as they can. So and POSE try to help them in that way.
Thank you. I'm sure there are questions in the audience. Before I open up, I would like to ask one final question, maybe limiting it to Sarah and to Stephen, who have programs that's been running a little bit longer. And that is, I would like to invite you to share a success story with us. A case that has gone particularly well, that is encouraging to all of us. Would you like to start, Stephen?
Thank you. And there are, fortunately, and a great many cases that have gone well, and people going back to the very beginning. I would like to think that of the 1930s generation, for example, 16 went on to get Nobel Prizes, which was pretty good. They're not until mostly the 1950s and 60s. And that's one of the problems we were talking about earlier today in a different session, which is and how do you recognize excellence early on, particularly when people you're dealing with are often quite early career academics, maybe in their sort of 30s, an early stage of their careers. But no, we have a good many people who have come, who've maybe done a PhD as part of their first step, and then went into postdoctoral work, and then went into a job. That's the ideal progression. And under UK visa rules for Syrians, there's a particular concession, which means they can renew visas or change visa categories without leaving the country. So you can do that sort of progression. So helping somebody sort of through that process and into a career when they started off pretty hopeless and with almost nothing, I think is a great success. And we just have a lot of people now who are working in universities who otherwise wouldn't be working in universities at all, and possibly wouldn't even be alive at all.
Sarah, a success story, something to lift us up.
Yeah, and like Stephen offered as well, I mean, there are actually hundreds of examples that I could offer. One I have in mind because she was with us recently in New York, and I can use her first name. In fact, I could use her whole name, but she's now open and affiliates with us very openly. She's from Syria, and she's a neuropharmacologist and premier scientist, had studied around the world, but really was committed to Syrian science and really promoting the work within Syria. And she was actually targeted in Syria in the early stages of the unrest in the country for standing behind her students who were opposing the regime. She openly defended them in the classroom. She rushed to their aid physically when some of them were physically affected. She was a huge voice on her campus, but she had to leave, and she thought it would be temporary. And we find now, 6 years later, she's now in the US. But it's taken 6 years of her time in the US to finally, and she just got, I think 2 weeks ago, confirmation that she has a tenure track position in California. She's building a lab, and she's studying the impact of trauma, neurological impact of trauma on fetuses, and not just at birth, but decades and sometimes generations later. And she's reflected on history, how people have been affected by trauma. And she's developing psychiatric drugs to study the impact of that, how drugs can be effective, but really looking at her own experience and bringing it forward. And I mention her case because she's not only a success and she's open and she's vocal, but she's not the typical scholar. And I'd like to say that scholars don't have to be so vocal and they don't have to be these heroes. And I think it's important to recognize that scholars can be quiet pioneers in their field. They don't have to be out there, speaking so openly about issues that may in fact harm their families back home. And I think it's often that we put emphasis on those who are bringing attention to certain issues in their country, and that is brave and courageous. But I think it's also important to remember that scholars are scholars, and they may just want to put their heads down and do their work. And so I bring her example as one, but I do think that any scholar who perseveres and continues in some way in exile is a success story. So I just hope that we can encourage everybody here and around the world who are struggling that there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you, Sarah. I would now like to take a few questions from the audience. If there are any, we have one microphone that can go around. If you could briefly introduce yourself before you ask your question. Over there. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Farouk Ibrahim. I came from Iraq. Phillip Schwartz initiatives. In the past, I was a fellow also for Cara in London University. I want to, in the beginning, to thank the speakers, and I want to ask for the risk that, the criteria of the risk that you are giving this scholarship for this fellow and not giving to the other. And the other thing I want to ask is there any local person in the committees that he can decide or can approve these people is really under risk or claiming risk or faking some documents and these things? Because this is really very important thing, because in our region, some exiles comes by the rectors of the universities themselves. I prefer this person on this person because this person belongs to me, and even if this more qualified.
Okay. So no, I thank you. So the question, how do we assess risk, actually, a very complex question.
Yeah. There's some risk is, some people living at risk locally, but in the committee, maybe in the individual case, he is not living under risk for some reason.
Yeah.
Or some.
Understood. I will give this question to maybe, if it's okay, to Sarah first, and then if you would to continue, because at the Humboldt Foundation, as you know, we do not assess risks, since we do not consider ourselves competent in this field. Rather, we collaborate with partner organizations, the Scholars at Risk Network, the Scholar Rescue Fund, and Cara, who are very experienced in that area, so we defer to their judgment.
Honestly, I have an unsuccessful case with the SRF because I don't know the situation or the decision at that time.
Okay.
In 2012.
Yeah, Sarah.
It is complex, and we, with each country we work with, particularly when we're hearing from scholars in large numbers from one country like Iraq, we build up a body of knowledge within the team, and so with each case we learn the dynamics and the political situations. A lot of it is desk research, so we hear from the scholar, we ask very extensive questions, but we require references from, typically, if possible, within their home country and outside of the home country to get a blended understanding of the concerns. We reach out to experts in the field, the person's academic field, but also if they're claiming a particular threat that we're not aware of or that's not known more widely, we'll often ask human rights organizations or academics who are studying that particular concern. More and more now that we have a large network of universities and scholars around the world who are versed on these topics, we reach out to them as well. So we never consider ourselves the experts. We're always reaching out to those who are well versed on a particular area. And then if it's a one individual case from a country we've never worked with before, it typically takes longer to do the vetting. But some cases are very widely known. Amnesty International might be supporting them in some way, or they're known in other ways in international communities. So those are the easier cases to assess. The hardest are those that are claiming corruption within their universities. And those cases are very difficult to come to determination. And that's why it's important, I think, to have a selection committee. It's not just one team making the assessment. We take it to a broad committee of experts.
Stephen, how do you go about it, Cara?
Generally similar. We ask for references from academic colleagues in their own country, and ideally one at least outside their own country. We ask them to explain what the risk is. Now, sometimes it's fairly obvious. For example, from Syria, until recently, at least anybody coming from the University of Aleppo was likely to be at some degree of risk. Similarly, anybody who is on the list of those who signed the petition in Turkey in 2016, since 180 of them are now on trial, I think it's fairly easy to assess that person is at risk. Sometimes it is much more difficult because the risk can be very general or very specific. It can be a question of being the wrong religion or the wrong ethnicity in a particular part of the country where they're living. It can be a question of sexual orientation in a country where being gay can get you killed. We've had cases like that where people have been contacting us, they are under direct threat, but it's a very personal one. How do you assess it? How do you judge it? It's difficult. You have to have a conversation with the person. Most of our applicants at the moment come from the Middle East. We have Arabic speakers working at Cara who are able to have those sort of conversations, just to help us to form an opinion as to what we're being told. But it is difficult, and ultimately you have to just make a decision sometimes based on your assessment of the person. When you haven't actually met them face to face, it's being done entirely by telephone or by emails. It is tricky. And we try to then sort of prioritize, just how urgent is it? Even in the quickest case, because people need visas, that process takes time. It can take a couple of months. There can be extra factors if the person, for example, is in Gaza and has to get out, essentially to Egypt, to be able to get out, it can take months before they can find their way out. So there are lots of delays. But we do try to prioritize on the basis of the threat to the person. And that for us is the key factor in deciding how we're going to prioritize the people we're trying to help.
Yeah, it's quite a very difficult job to do for our evaluators. Actually, the assessment process is conducted by what we call the Patronage Committee, which is composed of scientists from many disciplines, and some of them are experts of the countries of origin of our laureates. And when we don't have the good expertise, we can also ask other experts. We are constituting a pool of experts, and we have the support of the Ministry of Interior, which can inform us of the situation locally when we don't have the information or the expertise, and the applications. When the host institution sends application, there are also documents, testimonies, or press releases on the situation of the candidates.
Looking at the clock, there may be time for one brief question. Let's say, I think you were first.
Hello, I'm Oliver Vincent, University of Geneva and Swiss SAR section. Immigration is a big issue in many European countries. When you run referendums or elections, a very high percentage of the population is against massive immigration. I'm speaking of Switzerland here. So it's a first fact. The second fact you talked about during the presentation is that the academic system is a very competitive one. It's a pyramid where you have the PhD students at the very beginning and in the end the full professors. So when you are running fellowships in your programs, suppose the SRF or Cara, and you're introducing a fast track, I would say, for the scholars at risk, and that might be problematic I mean, you could face criticism from university staff because you're introducing discrepancy, dichotomy, and a fast track for scholars at risk. And for example, the post program, we discussed that you can propose something like €100,000 scholarship when you match funds together. Is that right? Yeah. So much. Yeah. Okay. But I mean, very high scholarships, which means that you place on the fast track those scholars high on the pyramid, and that you have people, PhD students or assistant professors under the scholars at risk. As it caused problems, did you have to face criticism from university staff on this aspect? And is there a reflection on how much the scholarships are high, how much you give to for the scholarships?
Is this a question to one specific person because we're running to Laura, or?
No, not specifically. I mean, those who are thinking about the level of the scholarships.
Would you like? I'll take that.
Yeah. Okay. It's true that there could be criticism, but it was a gamble to see if the host institutions would play the game, if I may say so, because we co-fund the scholarships, the grants, and actually we were surprised by the mobilization, because 80 institutions submitted applications. We have been able to allow grant to 60 of them, and in each institution there are different policies, but it's clear that it's a political involvement. And in France, I think that there was this need, and before POSE was created, institutions were trying to do some things to host academics at risk, but it was locally, and they didn't have much resources to do this. So I think there was an expectations and a very important mobilization, massive mobilization in the community. And it's true that we don't face so much criticisms from the higher education and research community. After that, in the public opinion, it's true that they might be, but the community of research is very mobilized.
I would echo what Laura says for the situation that we've experiencing here insofar as that you're referring to the competitiveness of the research market, the scientific, many people looking for jobs, and how is funding allocated. That's why it's important to have this win-win situation where it's really a very, very positive combination of having colleagues from different countries with different experiences together, and we've had only actually positive reactions. Also given, I think that's holds true for all of us, having specific programs, so it's extra money that is dedicated to a specific cause. Would you final call?
Yeah, just on that point, we solved that problem by being very mean. Nobody would call our Cara fellowships generous. Essentially, we give people what they need, what they and their family need to survive, but not much more than that, because that way the money we have, or the universities have, goes further and can help more people. So they aren't generous; they're really basic level of support. But of course, that's enough. And with only maybe 3 or 4 people at each university, we don't have more than 4 I can think of in any university currently. It's not such a big issue. They aren't so prominent. And of course, some fellows are very low profile anyway for their own reasons. So people don't necessarily know that they're even there, or they're being supported by us.
I'm afraid we've come not to the end of our discussion, but to the end of the time that we have for this session. I'm sure there are still many open questions, but I'm afraid we would have to defer them now to the coffee break, and the panelists, I think, will all be around if you have additional questions. So thank you very much for your attention, and see you.